Helsinki, 1947. A pine-crested invitation summons Miss Jane Marple to the snow-locked National Library, where a timber baron boasts of an island fortune. Within one blizzard night, he lies stabbed in the rare book's vault, a silver letter opener in his throat, cyanide melting in aquavit, blood staining a 1573 atlas, a folded fur coat, a stopped watch at 2:17, a sapphire earring, and a $500,000 insurance payable only on Finnish soil. 9 suspects, no footprints in the snow, every alibi as brittle as frost. In 7 razor-sharp chapters, the gentle spinster from Dunmead knits drag marks, poison crystals, and midnight vault keys into one lethal pattern. Stay for the click of needles that pins greed to the final page. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The letter arrived on a morning so cold that the milk on the doorstep had frozen solid in its bottle. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire in her small sitting room in Danemid Cottage, slit the envelope with the silver knife she kept for that purpose. The paper was thick, foreign, and bore a crest she did not recognize. A stylized pine tree beneath a crown of 7 stars. Dearest Aunt Jane, you will think me presumptuous, but I cannot resist. The National Library of Finland is hosting a winter symposium on borders in literature, and I have persuaded Director Lindström to extend an invitation to you. The dates are 14th to 18th January. Do say you will come. Helsinki in snow is like a city under glass, and the library itself, well, you must see it to believe it. My husband joins me in begging you to accept. We have reserved the guest suite on the 3rd floor, overlooking the Senate Square. Your affectionate pupil, Eleanor Virtanen, née Preston. Miss Marple laid the letter on the gate-legged table and considered. Eleanor Preston had been a pert, intelligent girl at the age of 15, always borrowing detective novels from the circulating library. Marriage to a Helsinki bookseller had evidently not dulled her enthusiasm. The fire crackled. Outside, the village lay hushed under a thin blanket of snow. The church clock struck 10 with a muffled note. Miss Marple's nephew Raymond had once urged her to travel. See the world before it sees the end of you, Aunt Jane. But she had always preferred the world to come to her, in the form of parish gossip, garden fetes, and the occasional murder. Yet the thought of a great library, snowbound and remote, stirred something she had not felt since the affair of the clergyman's wife and the poisoned blackberries. She reached for her writing case. My dear Eleanor, how very kind! I shall be delighted to accept, provided the trains are running. I leave the arrangements in your capable hands. Ever your affectionate. The reply came by return, brisk and businesslike. Passages booked on the SS Bortu from Hull to Stockholm, thence by rail to Helsinki. A fur-lined coat was recommended. The library's central heating, though modern, could not always prevail against a Baltic wind. On the appointed day, Miss Marple travelled up to London by the slow train from Market Basing, changing at St Pancras for the boat train to Hull. She carried one small valise, a handbag containing her knitting, and a tin of peppermint lozenges against seasickness. At Hull docks the Bortu loomed white and festive, its funnel already pluming against a sky the colour of pewter. The crossing was smooth enough for Miss Marple to finish 3 inches of a lavender scarf, and to observe her fellow passengers. A party of Swedish skiers. A Finnish commercial traveller with a briefcase chained to his wrist, and a thin woman in black who kept to her cabin and took her meals there. Miss Marple filed each away in the mental card index she had cultivated over 70-odd years. Stockholm greeted her with a flurry of snow and the smell of hot coffee from the station buffet. The connecting train to Helsinki was heated by a stove at either end. The seats were upholstered in dark green plush. Miss Marple shared her compartment with a Lutheran pastor, reading a German theological review, and a young woman in a squirrel coat who slept the entire journey. Her gloved hands folded over a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Darkness fell early. The train plunged through forests of pine so dense that the windows reflected only the passengers' own faces. At intervals, the locomotive whistled, a lonely sound swallowed at once by the snow. Miss Marple knitted steadily, counting stitches and lives with equal precision. It was past 9 when they drew into Helsinki Central Station. The platform was lit by flaring gas lamps. Porters in sheepskin coats shouted in Finnish and Swedish. A tall young man detached himself from the crowd and approached with the confident stride of one who has been sent on an errand of importance. "Miss Marple, I am Eero Virtanen, assistant to Director Lindström." He spoke English with a soft, precise accent. "My sister-in-law telegraphed your carriage number. The library van is outside." He took her valise as though it weighed nothing. Miss Marple followed, noting the way he scanned the crowd. Habit, perhaps, or caution. The van was a black Daimler with snow chains. The driver touched his cap and opened the rear door. Inside, the seats smelled of leather and warm petrol. A travelling rug had been laid ready. They moved off through streets already half deserted. Snow hissed against the windscreen. The wipers beat a steady rhythm. Past the great white cathedral on its hill. Past the harbour where the icebreakers lay with their lights winking red and green. Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the sea, black and solid to the horizon. "The library is on Union in Katu," Eero said. 10 minutes, no more. Director Lindström insists on welcoming you himself, though it is late." "I am accustomed to country hours," Miss Marple replied. "In Danemead we dine at 7 and are abed by 10. He smiled. "Here we keep library, hours. The symposium begins tomorrow at noon. Tonight you will meet only the resident staff and those guests who arrived early." The van turned into a side street flanked by neoclassical facades. Ahead rose the National Library, its columns floodlit against the night, windows glowing like the portholes of a liner. A porter in a braided uniform swung open the bronze doors. Warm air, scented with beeswax and old vellum, rolled out to meet them. Director Lindström awaited in the entrance hall beneath a chandelier of Bohemian crystal. He was taller than Miss Marple had expected, silver-haired, with the stoop of a man who had spent his life among tall shelves. His handshake was firm, his eyes kindly but appraising. "Welcome to Finland, Miss Marple. Your pupil speaks of you with reverence. We are honoured." "You are too kind," she murmured. "I am merely an old maid who likes a good book and a quiet corner." He laughed softly. "We can provide both. Come, let me show you to your room. The others are at supper, but I have kept a plate warm." They ascended a marble staircase, flanked by statues of Finnish worthies. On the 3rd floor, a corridor led past locked doors marked with brass plates. Manuscript repository, map vault, director's suite. At the far end, a smaller door stood ajar, revealing a fire burning in a tiled stove. The guest room was simply furnished. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a writing desk, an armchair upholstered in dark red. On the desk lay a vase of spruce branches and a card, with the compliments of the National Library. Eero set down the valise. "Supper in the long reading room in 20 minutes, if you would like to rest first." "Thank you, I am not tired." Miss Marple removed her hat and smoothed her iron-grey hair. "Tell me, Mr. Virtanen, who exactly is gathered here?" He hesitated, as though weighing how much to say. "Scholars mostly. Professor Bergman from Uppsala, rather loud. Dr. Korhonen, our own paleontologist. Mr. and Mrs. Mäkinen, he is in timber. Captain Eriksson, retired Navy. And Miss Lind, our cataloguer. A small party, but the snow may keep others away." Miss Marple nodded. "Snow has a way of clarifying matters. It covers a multitude of tracks." Eero looked at her sharply, then smiled. "I see Eleanor did not exaggerate. I will leave you to change." When he had gone, Miss Marple opened her valise and took out a grey wool dress suitable for evening. She laid it on the bed, then crossed to the window. Below, Senate Square lay under a fresh fall of snow. The statue of Alexander II, already wearing a white epauletted coat. Beyond, the cathedral bells began to strike 10, each note falling clear and cold into the night. She drew the curtains, turned the key in the stove to moderate the heat, and sat for a moment in the armchair. The house was quiet, yet not entirely so. Somewhere a clock ticked, and from the corridor came the faint creak of floorboards under a cautious tread. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same in Helsinki as in Denmark. Only the scenery changed, and the scenery, tonight, was very beautiful indeed. Chapter 2. The company assembled. The long reading room ran the length of the west wing, its ceiling painted with a trompe-l'oeil sky of drifting clouds and cherubim who had, over the centuries, acquired a faint patina of pipe smoke. 3 chandeliers of cut glass depended from gilt roses. Beneath them, a single table had been laid for 14, though only 9 places were occupied. Silver candlesticks marched down the damask cloth, their flames reflected in the dark windows that gave onto nothing but whirling snow. Miss Marple entered on Director Lindström's arm. Conversation paused for the briefest instant, long enough for her to register the quick inventory each guest made of the newcomer, then resumed with the polite murmur of cultivated people determined to be civil. A place had been kept for her at the director's right. Opposite sat Eleanor Virtanen, radiant in dove-grey silk, her fair hair coiled in the severe Scandinavian fashion. "Dear Aunt Jane," Eleanor said, rising to kiss her cheek, "you look exactly as you did when you marked my Latin prose. I have told everyone you are the only person alive who can decline Rosa in 6 cases without hesitation." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "One retains the useful fragments, my dear. The rest is mercifully forgotten." Director Lindström drew out her chair. "We are informal tonight. Tomorrow the symposium begins in earnest, and the scholars will quarrel over commas in medieval charters. Tonight we eat." The first course was served, clear reindeer consommé, in which floated a single translucent slice of smoked heart. Miss Marple tasted it and found it delicate, almost floral. She laid down her spoon and began quietly to catalogue the table. To her immediate left sat Professor Carl Bergman, Uppsala's authority on runic inscriptions. He was a large man with a mane of iron-grey hair, and a voice that carried to the rafters. At present, he was holding forth on the injustice of the 1940 border settlement. "Karelia," he declared, thumping the table so that the glasses trembled, was Swedish before it was Finnish, and Finnish before it was Russian. To cede it to Moscow was to tear the heart from Scandinavia. Across from him, Dr. Aino Koronen, slender and dark, regarded him with the cool patience of one who has heard the argument since childhood. She wore a high-necked dress of charcoal wool. A brooch, shaped like an ammonite, pinned the lace at her throat. "Geology, Professor, is indifferent to politics," she said. "The last ice sheet did not consult the Treaty of Tartu." Bergman snorted. "Geology? You would have us governed by glaciers." Miss Marple noted the faint compression of Dr. Korhonen's lips. Annoyance or amusement? Hard to tell. She turned, her attention to the head of the table, where Mr. Otto Mäkinen was carving a roast haunch of venison, with the concentration of a man who trusts no one else with a knife. He was broad, florid, expensively dressed. A diamond the size of a pea glittered in his tie-pin. Beside him, his wife Lilia toyed with a wine-glass. Her blonde head bent so that the candlelight slid along the pearls at her throat. She had the languid beauty of a fashion plate, but her eyes, pale blue and restless, moved continually about the room. Captain Nils Eriksson sat at Lilia's right, rigid in evening dress that had seen better decades. His moustache was waxed to points. His left hand, gloved even at table, rested on the cloth as though it might at any moment be required to salute. He had not spoken since the soup, but Miss Marple felt his gaze return again and again to the Mäkinens. The remaining place was occupied by Miss Sophia Lind, the cataloguer. She was small, precise, and plainly dressed in navy serge. Her spectacles flashed whenever she turned her head, which was often. She seemed to be counting the silver or checking that each napkin was correctly folded. When Director Lindström addressed her, she answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, and immediately bent again over her plate. Eero Virtanen, acting as host in his brother's absence, some urgent bookseller's business in Turku, moved about the table replenishing glasses. He poured cloudberry liqueur for Miss Marple, and, at her murmured request, a thimbleful only. "I preserve a clear head," she explained. "One never knows when it may be needed." Conversation flowed in eddies. Professor Bergman attempted to draw Captain Eriksson on naval matters. "You were at Hangö in 39, were you not?" But the captain merely inclined his head and reached for the salt. Lilia Mäkinen laughed at something Eero whispered and laid a gloved hand on her husband's sleeve. Otto shook it off with a grunt and signalled for more wine. Dr. Koronen leaned toward Miss Marple. "You are interested in paleography, I understand. Eleanor says you once identified a forged charter from a blot of ink." "A small matter," Miss Marple replied. "The forger used modern gallatanic acid. The original scribe had access only to oak galls and soot. One learns to notice discrepancies." Dr. Koronen's eyes brightened. "Discrepancies are my trade. Tomorrow I present a paper on mammoth molars found near Viipuri, now, alas, on the wrong side of the border." She glanced at Bergman, who was refilling his glass with aquavit. "Some discrepancies are harder to forgive than others." The venison was followed by a compote of lingonberries and cream so thick it had to be spooned from a silver bowl. Coffee was served in eggshell cups. Beside each saucer lay a lump of sugar shaped like a miniature pine cone. Outside the wind had risen. Snow tapped the window panes like impatient fingers. Director Lindström rose. "My friends, the hour grows late, and the weather unkind. The city trams have ceased running. The telephones are silent. We are, in effect, marooned. But the library is warm, the beds are aired, and the furnace stoked until morning. Let us consider ourselves a private club for the duration. A murmur of assent, half amused, half resigned. Chairs scraped. Miss Lind began to gather the coffee cups with the neatness of a conjurer palming cards. Lilja Mäkinen yawned behind her hand and announced that she would retire. Otto followed, steering her by the elbow with a proprietorial air that made Captain Ericsson's jaw tighten. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to admire a glass cabinet of illuminated manuscripts. In reality, she watched the company disperse. Professor Bergman cornered Eero by the fireplace and resumed his monologue on Karelia. Dr. Koronen slipped away toward the staircase, her footsteps light on the marble. Miss Lind vanished through a side door marked Staff Only. The captain stood for a long moment staring at the Mäkinens' retreating backs, then turned on his heel and disappeared into the shadows beneath the gallery. Director Lindström approached, offering his arm. "May I escort you upstairs? The corridors can be confusing after dark." "Thank you," Miss Marple said. "I have already memorized the route, but company is always pleasant." They climbed the great staircase. Halfway up, the director paused beneath a portrait of some 18th century bibliophile in a powdered wig. "You will forgive the theatricality of our situation," he said. "Snowstorms are not uncommon. But to have the entire symposium party trapped, well, it is the stuff of novels." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Novels, Director, are merely life with the dull parts left out. I suspect we shall find the next few days quite lively enough." He laughed softly. "You relieve my mind. I had feared an elderly English lady might find us barbaric." "Barbarism," she replied, "is a matter of motive, not latitude." At the door of the guest suite, he bowed. "Breakfast at 8 in the map room. After that, the symposium begins. Sleep well." Miss Marple entered, closed the door, and turned the key. The room was warm. The stove glowed cherry red. She removed her dress, folded it neatly over the chair, and donned a dressing gown of quilted silk. Raymond's Christmas gift 2 years ago, chosen more for warmth than fashion. From her valise, she took a small notebook bound in maroon leather and wrote, in her neat, slanting hand, Bergman, resentment over Karelia. Korhonen, scientific passion, controlled. Mäkinen, money, ostentatious. Mrs. M, bored, watchful. Ericsson, old grievance, disciplined silence. Miss Lind, nervous, efficient. She underlined the last entry twice, then closed the book and placed it on the bedside table. The house settled around her with the small noises of old buildings. A pipe ticking as it cooled, the creak of a beam, the muffled slam of a distant door. Somewhere below, a clock struck 11. Miss Marple opened the window a finger's breadth. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and coal smoke. Snow had ceased to fall. The sky was a deep indigo pricked with stars. Senate Square lay empty, the statue of the Tsar wearing its white mantle like a penitent. Far off, a dog barked once and was still. She closed the window, drew the curtains, and climbed into bed. The sheets were warmed by a stone bottle. The pillows smelled faintly of lavender. Yet sleep did not come at once. Her mind, trained by decades of parish intrigues, turned over the evening like a hand of patience. Money, borders, old grudges, common enough motives. But something else had flickered across the table, too swift to name. A glance, perhaps, or the absence of one. She would watch tomorrow when the symposium began, and the masks of scholarship were donned. Outside, the library slept beneath its blanket of snow, vast and secretive. Miss Marple turned off the lamp. In the darkness, the stove gave a small, contented sigh, as though the building itself approved her vigilance. Chapter 3. The Body in the Stacks. The library did not truly sleep. It merely lowered its voice. At 1:30, Miss Marple lay awake, the stone bottle at her feet now tepid, the stove ticking as it cooled. She had been dreaming of Danemead, of the vicar's wife, and the poisoned blackberries, when a sound intruded, the soft but unmistakable closing of a heavy door somewhere below. It was not the slam of carelessness, it was deliberate, the sound of someone who wished not to be heard. She rose, slipped her arms into the sleeves of her dressing gown, and thrust her feet into felt slippers. The corridor outside was lit only by a single wall lamp turned low. The air carried a faint chill from the great staircase. Miss Marple descended, one hand lightly on the banister, counting the steps out of habit. At the first landing she paused. A line of light showed beneath the door to the rare books vault, a narrow band of gold on the marble floor. She moved closer. The vault door was massive oak bound with iron, its lock a modern Yale set into the ancient wood. The key was in the lock, turned from the inside. Miss Marple tried the handle. It yielded at once. Warm air breathed out, smelling of vellum and the green-shaded desk lamp that burned within. Otto Mackinnon lay on his back between two mahogany cases, arms flung wide as though in astonished greeting. The silver letter opener from Director Lindstrom's study protruded from his throat at an angle that suggested a single downward thrust. Blood had spread in a dark symmetrical pool, soaking into the open pages of a 16th-century atlas. The map beneath his shoulders showed the Gulf of Bothnia. A red pencil line, freshly drawn, ran from Helsinki to a small island labelled in Gothic script, Mackinnon Timber Concession. Miss Marple knelt, careful to keep her slippers clear of the blood. The pocket watch in Mackinnon's waistcoat had stopped at 2:17. The glass was cracked as though by impact with the floor. His fur coat lay folded with precision on a nearby chair, gloves tucked neatly into one pocket. On the desk, the lamp cast a circle of light over scattered papers. A half-finished letter in Swedish, a railway timetable, and a small envelope addressed in a woman's hand to Captain N. Eriksson. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Miss Marple straightened as Captain Eriksson appeared in the doorway, a service revolver steady in his right hand. His evening dress was unchanged save for the absence of tie and collar. The top button of his shirt was fastened with a black stud. "I heard a cry," he said. His voice was flat, the tone of a man reporting the weather. His eyes moved from the body to Miss Marple and lingered on the letter opener. "You should not be here alone. Nor should you, Captain," she replied, "though I fancy we are both too old for scolding." He gave a short, humourless laugh and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "The vault is meant to be locked at 11. Miss Lind is meticulous. Yet the key is on the inside," Miss Marple observed. "Someone entered after her rounds, or persuaded her to leave it." Eriksson holstered the revolver beneath his coat. Mackinnon was not a man to wander libraries at night. He drank aquavit and boasted of yachts. Someone lured him here. Miss Marple bent again over the atlas. "The blood has not spread far. He was killed where he lies, or very near. But note the coat, folded, not dropped. He trusted his companion." A faint sound, a footfall, came from the corridor. Eriksson moved swiftly to the door and flung it open. The passage was empty, yet a draught stirred the papers on the desk. He closed the door and turned the key. "We must rouse Lindstrom," he said, "and the police, if the telephones are working." Miss Marple was examining the atlas more closely. "This map is from the 1573 Olaus Magnus. Rare, but not unique. The red line is modern pencil, 2B, I should say. Someone wished to draw attention to the island." Eriksson's mouth tightened. "Mäkinen bought that concession last year. Claimed it held the last virgin forest in the Gulf. There were irregularities." Before Miss Marple could reply, the electric light in the vault flickered once and steadied. Somewhere in the building, a generator coughed, then settled to a steady thrum. Eriksson glanced at his watch. 2:43. Less than half an hour since the watch stopped. They left the vault together, locking the door behind them. The key Eriksson slipped into his pocket. In the entrance hall, they found Director Lindstrom already descending the staircase in a crimson dressing gown, hair on end, a candle in one hand. "I thought I heard voices," he began, then saw their faces. "What has happened?" "Mäkinen is dead," Eriksson said bluntly. "Murdered in the vault." Lindstrom's candle wavered. Wax dripped onto the marble. "Impossible. The vault is locked at 11. It was locked from within." Miss Marple said gently, "We must wake the others. And someone must ski for the police. The roads will be impassable." Lindstrom set the candle on a console table. "There is a telephone in my office. I will try." He moved off toward the east wing, his slippers slapping softly. Eriksson looked at Miss Marple. "You are remarkably calm." "One learns composure," she said, "when one has buried 3 nephews and a favourite cat. Shall we wake the household?" They began with the guest rooms on the 3rd floor. Professor Bergman answered his door in a nightshirt and tasselled cap, blinking like a disturbed owl. "Murder? In a library? Preposterous!" He reached at once for his spectacles and a notebook, as though preparing a lecture. Dr. Koronen appeared fully dressed, a coat over her nightgown, boots in her hand. "I could not sleep," she explained. "The wind." Her face was pale but composed. Only her fingers, tightening on the bootlaces, betrayed agitation. Lilja Mäkinen opened her door a crack, then wider. She wore a peach silk wrapper. Her hair hung in a plait over one shoulder. "Otto? Dead?" Her voice rose to a wail that echoed down the corridor. She swayed, and Eriksson caught her elbow. "Steady, madam. We need you downstairs." Miss Lind, summoned from the staff dormitory on the ground floor, arrived with a large keyring and a ledger under her arm. Her spectacles were slightly askew. She straightened them with trembling fingers. "The vault key is missing from my board," she whispered. "I noticed at midnight." Eero Virtanen, roused from a small room behind the circulation desk, took charge of lighting the great chandelier in the entrance hall. Be its glare, the party assembled. 9 living souls and the knowledge of 1 dead. Snow pressed against the windows like a living thing. The wind had dropped, leaving a hush more ominous than any storm. Director Lindstrom returned, his face grim. "The lines are down, but the caretaker's boy can ski to the police barracks at Töölö. It is 3 kilometers. He knows the shortcuts." He looked at the circle of faces. "Until help arrives, no one leaves the building. The vault remains locked. Captain Eriksson has the key." Bergman cleared his throat. "And the motive? Mäkinen was not universally loved, but murder—" will be investigated, Ericsson cut in. For now, we return to our rooms. Miss Marple, may I escort you? She accepted his arm. As they climbed the staircase, she said quietly, You burned something in the furnace tonight, Captain. I smelled the smoke on your sleeve. He did not falter. Old letters. Nothing to do with this. Old letters have a way of surviving, she murmured, even in ashes. At her door he paused, lock it, and wedge a chair beneath the handle. Miss Marple smiled. I have managed 73 years without barricades, but I thank you for the thought. She entered, closed the door, and this time turned the key. The stove had burned low. She added 2 briquettes from the scuttle and watched the flames revive. Then she opened her notebook and added 3 lines in her small, precise script. Coat folded, trust. Watch stop 217, blow to chest. Red line on map, motive or misdirection. Outside, the first pale hint of dawn touched the snow. Somewhere below, a ski pole scraped against stone as the caretaker's boy set out into the white silence. Miss Marple drew the curtains and sat in the armchair, knitting needles idle in her lap. She had the curious sensation of being on a stage where the curtain had risen on an unfamiliar drama. Yet the lines were ones she had heard before. In a village hall, a vicarage drawing room, a train compartment smelling of wet umbrellas. Human nature, she reflected, required no passport. It travelled light and arrived unannounced. Chapter 4. The Closed Circle. The map room lay on the ground floor, a long apartment panelled in pale birch and lit by tall windows now blinded with snow. A dozen globes, terrestrial, celestial, and 1 curious specimen showing the moon's far side, stood on mahogany pedestals like silent sentinels. At the far end, a fire crackled in a hooded grate. Above the mantel hung a chart of the Baltic dated 1809, its coastlines inked in faded rose and Prussian blue. By 8 o'clock the entire household had assembled, summoned by handwritten notes slipped beneath doors. The caretaker's boy had returned with Inspector Lorry Ranter, a slight young man in a sealskin coat, his skis propped against the porter's lodge. He carried a leather satchel and an air of determined competence that faltered only when he surveyed the company. Scholars, a naval officer, a weeping widow, and 1 elderly English lady knitting placidly in the corner. Director Lindstrom performed introductions with the courtesy of a man opening a concert. Inspector Ranter, Helsinki homicide. He will require statements. Meanwhile, coffee. A samovar hissed on a side table. Beside it stood a tray of pulla, the sweet cardamom buns still warm from the kitchen. Miss Marple accepted a cup, but refused the bun. I find sugar clouds the judgment, she explained to Dr. Coronen, who was buttering her third. Inspector Ranter cleared his throat. The roads are blocked until the ploughs reach Union Inkatu. Perhaps noon, perhaps tomorrow. No one has entered or left the building since 10 last night. The caretaker confirms the great doors were chained at 11. Therefore, he paused, aware of the theatricality. The murderer is among us. Professor Bergman gave a bark of laughter. A locked room puzzle. I have written monographs on less. Lilja Makinen dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Otto was stabbed. Who would do such a thing? That, said Ranter, is what we shall discover. 1 at a time, please. Director, the vault. Lindstrom led the way. The party followed in a straggling procession, boots squeaking on the waxed floors. Miss Marple brought up the rear, her knitting bag over one arm. She noted that Captain Ericsson walked with his gloved hand inside his coat, and that Miss Lind clutched her keyring as though it were a rosary. The vault door stood ajar. A constable in uniform kept guard, his breath pluming in the cold air that leaked from the stacks. Inside, the scene was unchanged save for chalk outlines and a numbered card beside the atlas. Ranta knelt, peering at the blood pool through a magnifying lens. "No footprints in the dust beyond this point," he announced. "The window is sealed, double glazing, painted shut since 1918. The only entrance is this door." Miss Marple studied the window. A thin line of frost feathered the lower pane. Beneath it, the radiator gurgled softly. "The heating pipes run beneath the floor," she murmured. "Warm air rises. No condensation on the upper glass. Curious." Ranta looked up sharply. "Meaning? Nothing yet," she said. "Merely an observation." They returned to the map room. Ranta produced a notebook. Statements, beginning with the last person to see Mr. Mäkinen alive. Eero Virtanen raised a hand. "I served him aquavit at 20 minutes past 12. He was in the long reading room, arguing with Professor Bergman about timber quotas. Mrs. Mäkinen retired at 11:30. Captain Ericsson left shortly after. Lilja Mäkinen sobbed. "I took a powder and slept. I heard nothing." Bergman shrugged. Mäkinen was drunk. He boasted of a new concession, an island rich with spruce. I told him he was robbing Sweden's heritage. He laughed and called me a fossil. Dr. Koronen spoke quietly. "I walked in the periodicals room until 1. The moonlight on the snow, it helps me think. I saw no one." Miss Lind whispered. "I locked the vault at 11:05. The key hung on my board until—" she faltered, "until I noticed it gone at midnight. I thought I had mislaid it." Captain Ericsson's statement was clipped. "Old habit. I patrol when I cannot sleep. I passed the vault corridor at 1:30. All was quiet." Miss Marple, when her turn came, said only, "I woke at 2:15 to the sound of the vault door closing. I went down at once and found the captain already there." Ranta closed his notebook. "The letter opener is from Director Lindström's desk. Anyone might have taken it. The time of death, between 2 and 2:30, according to the medical examiner's preliminary telegram. The watch stopped at 2:17, probably when the body struck the floor." He looked around the circle. "No one admits to being in the East Wing after midnight. Yet someone was. I must ask you to remain within the public rooms until the snow clears." Professor Bergman muttered something about academic freedom. Lilja Mäkinen asked for sal volatile. Miss Lind began to count the keys on her ring, lips moving soundlessly. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Inspector, may I see the atlas again?" Ranta hesitated, then nodded. They returned to the vault. The great book lay closed now, a sheet of brown paper beneath it to protect the binding. Miss Marple opened it to the marked page. The red line was straight, ruled with a steady hand. "Note the pressure," she said. "Light at Helsinki, heavier toward the island. The drawer was impatient to reach his destination." Ranta frowned. Drawer. The murderer inspector. He or she wished us to notice the concession. A blind, perhaps, or a confession. She turned the page. Beneath, in the margin of a map of Lapland, someone had penciled a single word in block capitals. Cyanide. The ink was fresh, the letters uneven. Ranta whistled. "Poison, but the wound may be a blind also," Miss Marple said, "or insurance, in case the poison failed." They examined the desk. The half-finished letter was a business note to a Stockholm bank. The railway timetable showed a crossing to Tallinn on the 22nd. The envelope to Captain Ericsson was sealed. the flap tucked in the old-fashioned way. Runter slit it with his penknife. Inside was a single sheet. "Meet me in the vault at 2. Come alone. O.M. Blackmail?" Runter suggested. "Or an appointment the captain chose to ignore," Miss Marple replied. Back in the map room, the fire had burned low. Eero added logs. Sparks flew up the chimney like startled fireflies. Inspector Runter addressed the company. "We have a murder weapon, a locked vault, and a map with a threatening annotation. I propose we search the building systematically. Director Lindström, your permission." Lindström inclined his head. "The library is at your disposal." The search began. Miss Marple accompanied Dr. Coronen to the periodicals room, a cavern of steel shelves stacked with bound volumes of Suomen Kuvalehti and Geologiska Föreningens Förhandlingar. Dust lay thick on the upper shelves. A single set of footprints led to a table beneath a window. On the table lay an open notebook and a pencil, 2B, the lead worn to a blunt wedge. Dr. Coronen picked it up. "My pencil. I was sketching mammoth migration patterns." She showed the page. Neat diagrams of tundra and ice margins. "I left at 1:15. The pencil was here." Miss Marple examined the footprints. Small heel, broad toe, man's outdoor boot, but light, not the captain's. In the furnace room, they found the ashes Miss Marple had smelled on Ericsson's sleeve. Fragments of burnt paper, one bearing the printed letterhead of the Mäkinen Timber Company. A corner had escaped the flames. It read, "Payment in full by 1st of February, or the concession reverts." Captain Ericsson, questioned again, admitted burning the document. "A debt. Mäkinen held my pension notes from 1944. I paid what I could. He wanted more." Lilja Mäkinen, overhearing, laughed shrilly. Otto collected debts the way others collect stamps. He insured his life for 500,000 marks, payable only if he died on Finnish soil. The island concession was worthless without him. Inspector Ronter's eyes narrowed. "You profit by his death, madam." "I was asleep," she cried. "Ask Miss Lind. She brought me a hot brick at midnight." Miss Lind nodded miserably. "I did. Mrs. Mäkinen was in bed, the powder taken." The search continued. In the staff cloakroom, a fur coat, Lilja's, hung beside a pair of galoshes crusted with snow. The hem was damp. A single pine needle clung to the fur. Runter held it up. "Snow from the courtyard. Someone went outside after the storm began." Lilja turned pale. I walked on the terrace for air. Before bed. At 11:30? Runter pressed. She began to weep again. By noon the library was thoroughly turned over. No poison was found, no second weapon, no bloodied garment. The snow outside remained unbroken save for the ski tracks of the constable and the caretaker's boy. The party gathered once more in the map room, weary and on edge. Inspector Runter closed his satchel. "We wait for the ploughs. Until then, no one enters the east wing alone. Captain Ericsson, you will keep the vault key. Miss Marple," he hesitated, "your assistance is unofficial, but welcome." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am merely a guest, Inspector, but guests sometimes notice what hosts overlook." Outside, the sun struggled through the clouds, turning the snow to a blinding glare. Inside, the fire settled into embers, and the globes cast long shadows across the maps of a world that had, for the moment, shrunk to the size of one snowbound building. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The lavender scarf grew, row by row, while her mind arranged and rearranged the pieces. A folded coat, a stopped watch, a red line on a map, a burnt letter, a pine needle on fur. Somewhere in the pattern lay the truth, patient as a spider in its web. Chapter 5. Motives in Margins. The staff canteen lay in the basement, a white-tiled room smelling of boiled coffee and caraway. At 2 o'clock the party assembled there by common consent. The map room had grown oppressive, its globes seeming to watch them with brass indifference. A long table was laid with rye bread, smoked herring, and a tureen of barley soup kept hot over a spirit lamp. Miss Lind presided over the samovar with the air of a priestess at a minor rite. Inspector Runter had gone to the porter's lodge to await the snowplough. Captain Eriksson stood guard at the vault. The remaining 7 sat in a loose circle, steam from their bowls rising between them like incense. Professor Bergman broke the silence. Mäkinen was a vandal. He felled old-growth forest for pulp. I told him so last Michaelmas, in this very room. He laughed and said trees were money on the hoof. He tore a hunk of rye bread with strong yellow teeth. Still, murder is not criticism. Dr. Koronen buttered her bread with precision. He bulldozed a fossil bed near Sortavala. Irreplaceable. I wrote to the ministry. He bought the minister's silence with a yacht. Her voice was level, but the knife trembled slightly. Lilja Mäkinen had ceased weeping. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She wore a black dress borrowed from Miss Lind, the hem turned up with pins. Otto changed after the island deal. He kept the papers locked in his dispatch case. Said it would make us rich enough to leave Finland forever. She gave a brittle laugh. I wanted Paris. He wanted Tallinn. Miss Marple, seated between Eleanor and Eero Virtanen, asked gently, Did he insure his life heavily, Mrs. Mäkinen? Lilja's cup rattled in its saucer. 500,000 marks. The policy arrived last week. I signed as witness. He said it was prudent. She looked round the table as though daring contradiction. Eero poured coffee. My brother sold Mäkinen the policy. Otto paid in cash. Krugerrands. Said banks were for fools. Professor Bergman snorted. Typical. He distrusted everything except his own greed. Miss Lind, passing the herring, murmured, Mr. Mäkinen requested 3 books yesterday. I fetched them myself. She recited from memory. Naval Blockades of the Gulf 1918, Poisons and Their Detection, Leipzig 1897, and Lapland Inheritance Customs, Helsinki 1923. He kept them in the small reading alcove off the long room. Dr. Koronen's head came up sharply. Poisons. The volume is missing, Miss Lind said. I noticed this morning. A small silence fell. Outside, the plough's engine could be heard in the distance, a low growl growing nearer. Miss Marple laid down her spoon. May we see the alcove? They trooped upstairs. The alcove was a bay window overlooking the courtyard, furnished with a gate-legged table and 2 leather chairs. Mäkinen's dispatch case lay open. Papers spilled across the blotter. The 2 legitimate books were there, but the poison treatise was gone. Miss Marple lifted the dispatch case. It was heavy pigskin, the lock forced. Inside, share certificates, a map of the disputed island annotated in red, and a folded sheet headed Insurance Policy. Beneficiary Lilja Mäkinen, ne Lindros. A clause in small type specified payment only in the event of death within the Republic of Finland. Lilja stared at the clause. He never told me that part. Eero picked up the map. This island, Kaljusari, was ceded to the Soviets in 1940, then quietly returned last year under a timber agreement. Mäkinen bought the logging rights for a song. The Soviets wanted hard currency. Bergman leaned over his shoulder, and the Finns were not consulted. Typical Mäkinen. Miss Marple turned to the bookshelves, behind the chairs. A gap showed where the poison volume had stood. Dust outlined its shape. She ran a finger along the shelf and examined the faint grey smudge. "Talcum powder," she said. "Someone handled the book with gloved hands, or after powdering their face." Lilia flushed. "I used talc, but I never touched his books." They returned to the canteen. Inspector Ranta met them at the foot of the stairs, snow on his shoulders. "The plough has reached Senate Square. A doctor and 2 constables are with me. The body will be removed within the hour." He noticed the dispatch case in Eero's hand. "Evidence?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "But first, the furnace room." The furnace room was a brick cavern beneath the east wing. A coal fire glowed behind iron bars. Ashes overflowed the scuttle. Miss Marple took a poker and stirred the embers. Fragments of burnt paper rose in the draught. She teased out a corner that had escaped complete destruction. Cyanide crystals dissolve in spirits. Ranta bagged the fragment. "So the wound may be a blind. Or a precaution," Miss Marple said. "If the poison acted slowly, the killer needed certainty." They examined the coal scuttle. Beneath a layer of fresh coal lay a twist of paper. Chemist's packet, the label half burned, potassium cyanide, for photographic use, empty. Dr. Coronen went very still. "The photographic darkroom is next to the map vault. We develop survey plates there. I keep reagents locked in a cupboard." The darkroom door stood ajar. The cupboard had been forced. A broken hasp hung loose. Inside, the cyanide bottle was missing. Ranta turned to the company. "Who has access to this room?" Miss Lind raised a trembling hand. "All senior staff, and guests with special permission. Mr. Makinen had permission. He photographed timber charters last month." Lilia Makinen's voice was a thread. "Otto drank aquavit every night. A thimbleful of crystals." Professor Bergman slammed his fist on the workbench. "Enough! We are scholars, not Borgias." "Yet one of us is," Miss Marple said mildly. They returned upstairs. The constables were stretchering the body through the entrance hall, a sheet over the face. Lilia gave a small, choked cry and turned away. In the long reading room, Miss Marple asked Miss Lind to reconstruct the previous evening's movements on the Great Wall chart used for symposium schedules. With coloured pins, she marked each person's location, hour by hour. 11 Zug, all in long room except Miss Lind, locking vault, and Dr. Korhonen, retiring. 11:30, Mrs. Makinen to bed with hot brick. 12:20, Makinen and Bergman arguing. Eero serves last aquavit. 1:00, Dr. Korhonen in periodicals room. 1:30, Captain Eriksson patrols East Corridor. 2:15, Miss Marple hears vault door. 2:17, watch stops. 2:43, Miss Marple and Eriksson discover body. Gaps showed like missing teeth. Miss Marple studied the chart. Head tilted. "Notice," she said, "that between 12:20 and 1, only Makinen and Bergman are accounted for in the long room. Yet the aquavit bottle was nearly empty. Someone refilled glasses, or Makinen's glass alone." Eero fetched the bottle from the sideboard. A faint sediment clung to the bottom, colourless crystals beginning to dissolve. Ranta sniffed it and recoiled. "Bitter almonds! Cyanide!" Lilia Makinen sank into a chair. "I poured Otto's last glass myself, at 11:45. He complained it was weak. I added a splash from the decanter." Bergman stared. "You poisoned your own husband." "I did not. The decanter was full when I left." Miss Marple picked up the decanter. Cut crystal, heavy stopper. A faint white residue coated the inside of the neck. "Crystals sprinkled into the spout," she said. "They would dissolve slowly as the liquor was poured. The last glass would be the strongest." She turned to Miss Lind. "You locked the vault at 11:05. Was the key returned to your board?" Miss Lind nodded. "At 11:10. I saw it there." "Yet it was missing at midnight," Ranter said. "Someone borrowed it," Miss Marple continued, "used it between 11:10 and midnight, then replaced it, or intended to. But the murder required a second visit at 2. Dr. Coronan spoke suddenly. "The vault key opens the darkroom as well. Same Yale series." A silence. Then Captain Erickson's voice from the doorway. "The vault is undisturbed, but I found this on the floor." He held up a sapphire earring, Lilia's. Lilia touched her ear. "I lost it yesterday. Otto was furious. It was a birthday gift." "Found beside the Atlas," Erickson said, "after the body was moved." Ranter's eyes gleamed. "Mrs. Mackinnon, you will come with me." Lilia rose, swaying. "I was in bed." Miss Marple's voice cut across the room, soft but clear. "No, my dear. You were in the darkroom at 11:50 fetching cyanide. You poisoned the decanter, then waited. When Otto collapsed in the long room, you dragged him to the vault, using his coat as a sling, which explains the folded garment. You stabbed him to hasten death and to suggest a scholarly quarrel. The earring was torn off in the struggle." Lilia's face crumpled. "He was going to leave me. The island was a lie. Debts everywhere. The insurance." She collapsed, sobbing. Ranter caught her wrists and snapped on handcuffs. Professor Bergman exhaled slowly. "So greed, after all." Miss Marple returned to her knitting. "Greed and a miscalculation. The snow kept her from fleeing. In Ganymede, we say the weather is often on the side of justice." Outside, the plough's blades scraped the last of the snow from Unioninkatu. Sunlight poured through the windows, striking blue sparks from the chandeliers. The library, vast and serene, resumed its ancient business of keeping secrets, though one, at least, had been gently pried loose. Chapter 6. The Reconstruction. The long reading room had been cleared of supper's ghosts. The damask cloth rolled away, the candlesticks returned to their cabinet, the aquavit decanter, now sealed in a police envelope, taken to the porter's lodge. Only the great table remained, bare mahogany gleaming under the chandeliers. At 8 o'clock, Inspector Ranter assembled the household for what he called, with a certain relish, the final act. Snow still lay deep outside, but the ploughs had carved a narrow lane to the police van. 2 constables stood at the doors, breath pluming. The company took their places as though for a lecture. Director Lindstrom at the head, Miss Marple at his right, knitting needles silent for once. Lilia Mackinnon was absent, locked in the assistant librarian's office under guard. The others sat in a half-circle, faces pale in the electric light. Ranter began briskly. "Mrs. Mackinnon has confessed to the insurance motive, but denies the act. She claims the earring was planted. We require certainty." He nodded to Miss Marple. "Madam, the floor is yours." Miss Marple folded her hands over the lavender scarf, now nearly a yard long, and spoke in the gentle tone she might have used to explain a discrepancy in the Women's Institute accounts. "We must begin with the body's position. Mr. Mackinnon lay between the Atlas and the desk, blood in a perfect circle. Yet the letter opener entered at a downward angle, and the watch stopped at 2:17. A man stabbed in the throat does not fall neatly. He staggers, clutches, collapses forward or sideways. The pool was too symmetrical, the coat too carefully folded. Conclusion, he was dead or unconscious before the blade was used. Professor Bergman stirred. Poison, then. Precisely. Cyanide in the aquavit. The crystals were introduced into the decanter's spout between 11:45, when Mrs. Mackinnon poured her husband's glass, and 12:20, when Eero served the last round. The decanter stood on the sideboard, accessible to anyone who passed. Dr. Corhanen frowned, but the sediment dissolved slowly. The first glasses were harmless, the last lethal. Mr. Mackinnon drank steadily. By 1 o'clock, he would feel dizziness. By 1:30 collapse. Captain Ericsson's gloved hand rested on the table. I saw him at 12:40. He was swaying but coherent, boasting about the island. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then the poison acted between 1:30 and 2. You, Captain, were patrolling the East Corridor at 1:30. You saw no one? No one. Yet someone was moving the body. Note the scuff marks on the parquet outside the vault. 2 parallel lines, 6 inches apart, ending at the chalk outline. The coat, folded double, was used as a sling. A woman's strength would suffice if she dragged rather than lifted. Miss Lind gave a small gasp. The coat was folded, neatly, gloves inside the pocket. Mr. Mackinnon trusted his killer enough to remove it in the long room. He collapsed there, was dragged here, stabbed, and arranged to suggest a scholarly quarrel over the atlas. The red line on the map was drawn earlier. Note the pressure variation. The murderer wished us to notice the island. Runter produced the atlas, now wrapped in tissue. The line ends at the concession boundary. A taunt? Or a distraction, Miss Marple said. The true motive was the insurance clause. Death on Finnish soil. The island papers were a blind. The policy was the prize. She turned to Miss Lind. You locked the vault at 11:05 and saw the key replaced at 11:10. Yet it was missing at midnight. Who had access to your board? Miss Lind's voice trembled. Anyone who passed the circulation desk. I was fetching Mrs. Mackinnon's hot brick between 11:10 and 11:20. Ample time to borrow the key, enter the darkroom, force the reagent cupboard, and take the cyanide. The key was returned, or meant to be, before midnight. Eero Virtanen spoke. I refilled the aquavit at 12. The decanter was half empty. I noticed nothing. You would not, Miss Marple said. The crystals were sprinkled into the spout, not the body of the liquor. A pinch only, enough for the final glasses. She rose and walked to the sideboard, demonstrating with an empty carafe. One tilts the spout thus, taps the packet. See? The crystals slide down the neck and lodge just above the liquid. As each measure is poured, a few dissolve. The last glass is fatal. Professor Bergman muttered, fiendish. Practical, Miss Marple corrected. The murderer needed only to wait. When Mr. Mackinnon collapsed in the long room, say at 1:50, she dragged him to the vault using the coat. The letter opener was taken earlier from the director's desk, the atlas open to the marked page. The stabbing ensured death and created the illusion of sudden violence. Dr. Corhanen asked, the earring? Lost in the struggle to position the body. Mrs. Mackinnon wore sapphires last night. The clasp was loose. I noticed when she leaned over the soup tureen. It tore free as she arranged the coat. Ronta held up the earring. Found beside the atlas after the body was moved. The chalk outline covered it initially. Miss Marple resumed her seat. The timing is tight but possible. Mrs. Mackinnon retired at 11:30, ostensibly to bed. Instead, she slipped down the service stair. Miss Lind was in the kitchen with the brick. She entered the dark room, took the cyanide, returned the key by 11:50. She then rejoined her husband in the long room, poured his glass, and waited. When he fell, she acted. Captain Ericsson's voice was rough. I passed the long room at 1:40. It was empty. You passed the doorway. The alcove is to the left, shielded by the screen. She heard your step, waited, then dragged the body the shorter distance to the vault. 20 feet, no more. Inspector Runter nodded slowly. The scuff marks begin at the alcove rug. We measured. Miss Marple continued. She locked the vault from within, intending to leave by the window. But the lower pane was painted shut, the upper too high. She exited by the door, locking it behind her with the borrowed key, and returned it to the board before Miss Lind's midnight round. Miss Lind whispered, I found it there at 12:15. I thought I had imagined its absence. The plan was flawless, but for the snow, Miss Marple said. It prevented escape and kept us all together. Mrs. Mackinnon staged hysterics to deflect suspicion. The earring was an accident. Silence settled over the room. Outside, the police van's engine turned over, ready to depart. Runter closed his notebook. Mrs. Mackinnon will be charged. The confession is signed. Director Lindstrom rose. And the library. We'll reopen tomorrow, Runter said. The vault will be cleaned. The atlas, alas, must go to evidence. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. A small price. Books survive worse than bloodstains. As the company dispersed, Dr. Coronen lingered. You saw all this from a folded coat. I saw trust, Miss Marple replied, and the absence of panic. A wife who loved her husband would have screamed at once. Mrs. Mackinnon wept only when convenient. In the entrance hall, the constables escorted Lilja Makinen to the van. She walked between them dry-eyed, the black dress hanging loose on her frame. At the doors, she paused and looked back, once, toward the vault. Then the doors closed, and the van's taillights disappeared into the white night. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the tracks fill with fresh snow. Behind her, the chandeliers dimmed to a single bulb. The library settled into its familiar hush. Somewhere, a clock struck 9, clear and unhurried. She opened her notebook and added a final line. Case closed. Snow melts, truth endures. Then she closed the book, slipped it into her bag and went upstairs to pack. The symposium would continue without her. Director Lindstrom had insisted she remain as guest of honor, but she had seen enough of boarders, literal and moral, for one winter. In the guest suite, the stove burned low. Miss Marple folded the lavender scarf, placed it in her valise beside the maroon notebook, and drew the curtains. Senate Square lay silent under a thin new fall. The statue of Alexander II wore his white coat with imperial dignity. Tomorrow the trams would run, the telephones ring, the world resume its ordinary deceptions. She smiled to herself. In Helsinki or Ganymede, the pattern was the same: a folded coat, a stopped watch, a woman who mistook money for security. Human nature, like snow, covered much, but never quite enough. Chapter 7. The Denouement. The snow had ceased entirely by dawn, leaving her Helsinki muffled and immaculate. In the long reading room, the chandeliers were dark. Only the tall windows admitted a cold, pearly light that turned the mahogany table to silver. A single place had been laid at the far end. White coffee cup, a plate of korvapusti still fragrant from the oven, and a small vase of spruce twigs. Director Lindstrom stood beside it, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Miss Marple entered at 8, valise in one hand, knitting bag in the other. She wore her travelling coat of dove-grey wool, and the neat felt hat she had bought in Hull. The lavender scarf was wound twice about her throat. "I feared you would slip away without ceremony," Lindström said. "Ceremony is for the young," she replied, "but coffee is for everyone." He drew out her chair. "The police van left an hour ago. Mrs. Makinen is in custody. Inspector Ranter telephoned his thanks. Unofficial, of course." Miss Marple poured coffee. Steam curled between them. Unofficial thanks are the most sincere. Lindström hesitated. "There is one matter. The Atlas, Olaus Magnus 1573, cannot be restored. The blood has soaked through 3 leaves. The board wishes to offer you a token." He placed a small morocco case on the table. Inside lay a silver bookmark engraved with the library crest and the date. She turned it in her fingers. "Very proper. I shall use it in my prayer book." A silence, companionable rather than awkward. Outside a tram bell clanged. The city stirred. Lindström cleared his throat. "You will forgive an old scholar's curiosity. How did you know it was not the captain? He burned papers, carried a revolver, hated Makinen." Miss Marple sipped her coffee. "Hatred is loud, Director. Captain Ericsson's silence was disciplined, not secretive. He burned a debt, not a conscience, and he folded his own coat in the war. Habit dies hard. Mrs. Makinen folded her husband's to hide the drag marks." Lindström nodded slowly. "And the earring?" "A woman's vanity. She wore the sapphires to dinner, though the clasp was loose. Pride goeth, as we say." He smiled. "You quote the Bible now." "Only when it fits the facts." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Eero Virtanen appeared, coat over his arm. "The taxi is here, Miss Marple. The Boar 2 sails at noon." She rose. "Then I must not keep the Baltic waiting." Lindström accompanied her to the entrance hall. The great doors stood open. Cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and petrol. The taxi idled at the foot of the steps, its engine ticking. Professor Bergman emerged from the porter's lodge, muffled in a bearskin coat. "Miss Marple, I have a monograph. Runes and murder motifs in the Kalevala. You must read it." She accepted the parcel with a twinkle. "I shall study it on the crossing. Thank you, Professor." Dr. Korhonen followed, carrying a small wooden box. "Mammoth ivory, carved by a student, for your nephew." She pressed it into Miss Marple's hand. Miss Lind hovered at the foot of the staircase, Keyring silent for once. "The vault is cleaned. The atlas. We have photographed the undamaged pages." Miss Marple touched her arm. "Books endure. So do librarians." Captain Ericsson was last. He saluted stiffly. "My revolver is returned. The debt is cancelled. Makinen's estate settles it. I owe you that, at least. You owe yourself a quieter conscience, Captain." He almost smiled. The taxi door stood open. Miss Marple climbed in, arranging her valise and parcels on the seat. Lindström leaned through the window. "You have saved more than our reputation. You have reminded us that truth is the rarest volume in any collection." She considered. "Truth is often misshelved, Director, but it is always there if one knows the catalogue." The driver engaged gear. The taxi moved off, tires crunching on packed snow. Through the rear window, Miss Marple watched the library recede. Columns, statues, the great bronze doors closing with a soft thud. Senate Square lay empty, save for a single set of footprints leading from the steps to the waiting tram. She opened her notebook for the last time. Motive? Insurance, 500,000 marks. Method? Cyanide in aquavit, stabbing to hasten. Mistake, snow, earring, folded coat. Moral, greed borrows tomorrow's grief. She closed the book, slipped it into her bag, and took up her knitting. The lavender scarf was finished. She began a new one in soft blue, something for Eleanor's expected child. The taxi turned into Alex and Terinka too. Shop windows glittered with post-Christmas sales. A boy sold hot sausages from a brazier. Two sailors argued in Swedish over a map. Helsinki, released from its white prison, resumed its ordinary miracles. At the South Harbour, the Boat waited, funnel pluming against a sky the colour of pearl. Porters swarmed with luggage, gulls wheeled overhead. Miss Marple paid the driver, gathered her parcels, and walked up the gangway with the unhurried step of one who has seen the worst and found it, after all, manageable. In her cabin she arranged the silver bookmark in her prayer book, the mammoth ivory on the writing desk, the monograph beside the porthole. Then she sat by the window and watched the icebreakers nose through the floes. The ship's bells sounded, hawsers were cast off. The deck trembled as the engines engaged. Finland slipped astern. White fields, dark pines, the spire of the cathedral pricking the horizon. Miss Marple knitted steadily, counting stitches and lives with equal calm. Somewhere behind her, in a snowbound library, a woman faced justice for a crime born of vanity and fear. Ahead lay the grey Baltic, the slow train to Stockholm, the boat train to Hull, and eventually the familiar chime of Danemead church clock. She smiled to herself. Murder, like travel, broadened the mind, but home, she reflected, was the only place where one's own chair fitted perfectly. The Boat gathered speed. Helsinki vanished in a swirl of snow and smoke, and Miss Jane Marple, having set one small corner of the world to rights, turned her thoughts to lunch and